Let's jump into today's discussion with Jim about his new book, Wise Decisions. So, Jim, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
I'm really excited to be with you, Andy, and I hope we can create some value for your audience.
I'm looking forward to that discussion. You make I think, a profound point in the book that a single bad decision can alter the trajectory of one's life in tragic ways for years. So, as a way to learn more about you, I want to take the flip of that. Like, what's an example of a single good decision that you made, regardless of age, that altered the trajectory of your life in a good way?
So I went on and got my master's and doctorate in psychology, and I was trained in community mental health. And very early in my career, I became chief psychologist and executive director of a very large community mental health center system that served the whole central and southern part of Colorado. That's what I thought I would do for the rest of my life. But I became best friends with a guy by the name of Dr. Joe Vigil, who's an Olympic legend. And, he got me running, and he really got me to think about the application of psychology to human performance. And he said, Jim, of all that you know, what can you tell me to help my athletes actually perform better, get more out of their talent and skill? And I looked at him like a deer in headlights, and I said, Joe, I don't have a clue. I know something about helping people who are struggling with mental health issues get a little healthier, but I don't really know anything about taking someone who's normal and making them extraordinary. And he said, well, Loehr, you ought to get into that field. This was in the 70s. And he said, this is going to be big. You love adventure. You really have a curious mind. I think I'm going to push you to start looking into that. So I did all this literature searches, and eventually I resigned. The decision was I was going to go pursue this. I resigned to a 23-member board of directors. I told them I was leaving. The center was doing fabulously, and they gave me a massive increase in salary, thinking it was a ploy for more money. And I said, oh, no, I'm so sorry. That's not my motivation. I'm going to apply psychology to performance. And they go, what the world is that? There's no such thing. And I said, I know.
Not yet.
So they duly thought maybe I couldn't handle the stress, and I lost a lot of my friends, all my colleagues and everything. They didn't understand what I was doing. So that decision changed the trajectory of my life. And I am so happy that I did that, because I've been on fire for my entire career.
It's a good example. It would have been so much easier to say no, right? Stick with what was comfortable. That would have been the easier decision.
Everyone said, you are a fool. You've reached the pinnacle in your profession. Why would you do this? And it was really hard for me to explain it, except I said, I really, really want to do this and make a contribution in that area.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. We often think of decisions as either being good or bad, and that's often determined how it turns out. But you wrote a book about wise decisions, not just good decisions. So what do you mean by wise, and, what does it not mean for that matter?
Well, it's interesting. All of us have a repository of wisdom that we tap into for making important decisions. And what we wanted to know, and this book I don't think could have been written many years ago, because we didn't have the science. Dr. Daniel Kahneman was a brilliant, brilliant psychologist who wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and was a brilliant thinker, and he's also a brilliant economist. And a lot of his work played directly into what we were trying to do, is to understand the neurobiology of decision-making, where are decisions made in the brain, and how can we take more conscious, intentional control over the process. So we dug into that. It's the first, I think, science-based approach where we looked at the decision-making process under a microscope and tried to figure out, what could we learn practically that can help people make better decisions? And the extreme limits of that are to tap into our wisdom. And we all have wisdom. There's wisdom in the body. There's wisdom emotionally. There's wisdom in our intuition. There's wisdom in this massive neural processor, this, rational, logical brain, our cortex and neocortex. And if we put all that together, we might avoid some of the calamities that are often made by making a decision too quickly and without a lot of good, really careful consideration.
I think if I understand the idea from the book is you can make a wise decision that doesn't turn out well, but it was a wise decision by the information you had. Where it's a matter of am I able to lift myself up and look at it from different perspectives and have a more intentional decision? It may not even turn out right, but as opposed to the instinct or the easy decision. Is that possible?
Yeah. So the estimates are that we make around 35,000 decisions a day.
Huh.
That's a lot. And we make somewhere around 245,000 a week and over 12 million in a given year. So that is now any one of those decisions can set us in a trajectory that can be really unfortunate.
Hmm.
And most of those decisions are automatic.
Hmm.
When I ask people, what are you referencing when you make your decisions? They really are very foggy. They don't really know exactly. They just kind of, I think this is what I should do.
Yeah.
They're not sure what it is. So it's so interesting to both Sheila and I, my co-authors, a brilliant Sheila Walker Olson is a brilliant behavioral. She's in behavioral genetics, and she's a very competent researcher. We wanted to do something that was really based on as much available science as we could, and what we really came to was that it's really surprising that parents don't know how to teach decision making. They don't even teach it. They don't. If you ask them how do they teach it, they have no idea. It's not taught in kindergarten. It's not taught in grade school.
Yeah.
It's not taught in junior high or high school. It's not taught in colleges. It's not taught in most graduate schools, and it's not taught in most corporate universities. But I would argue, and this is my 18th book, that of all the books I've written, I just wish I had come to this much earlier, but I just don't think the science was fully, birthed yet. But I think it's the most important work I have done in my entire career, that to try to help people understand the importance of decision making and how do you teach it? How do you teach it to your children, and how do leaders in the corporate world take advantage of what we've learned so that, like maybe every Friday at 10 o'clock, there's a meeting of your direct reports, and we take apart every major decision that was made, let's say in the previous week or in the last month, and we look at how it played out and what were the processes you went through to get to that decision. So rather than being an automatic, that's the fast side of our brain, and our brains have a preference for that because it doesn't consume as much energy. The economics is much easier. But to be deliberate and intentional and to have a specific way of handling that is a very different way for most people of managing this space between the stimulus and response. We feel much more comfortable just kind of flying from the hip. And when we look at the data, people end up making some of the worst decisions possible in situations where they haven't been nearly comprehensive enough and looking at it through a number of lenses. Had they done that, they probably would not have made that decision. But you're right. Sometimes you go through every possible, kind of maneuver you can, mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, and you still got it wrong. But I will tell you, you probably won't feel like you need to beat yourself up because you did everything you could to make, and under those same circumstances, armed with the same information, you would probably make the same decision again.
That's a great way to clarify that. I think you're right. I mean, I don't remember decision making as a something in a curriculum. In fact, I've read plenty of books and interviewed plenty of people, but I feel like most of what's taught about this is about biases, and you had some of that, about
Right.
process, and you've got some of that. But I don't remember seeing a book that puts such impactful focus on health and how it impacts decision making. In
Mm.
fact, I think it's undeniable in the book that holistic health, the mental, physical, emotional, spiritual, it's the vital starting point for wise decisions, right? And so, why is this maybe more important than what we realize?
Well, it's so interesting. As the co-founder of the Human Performance Institute in Florida, that we eventually sold to Johnson and Johnson, but by the time I left, we had somewhere around 400,000 people. And we had the most amazing faculties, commander of the SEALs, commander of the Blue Angels, fighter pilots, elite instructors from the Air Force Academy, gold medalists, silver medalists. And we had a faculty that was absolutely unimaginable.
That's been so fun.
And it was the most fun I've ever had in my life by
Yeah,
far.
yeah.
And we also had the most incredible collection of people trying to go to the next level. Everything from sumo wrestlers from Japan spent 6 months with us, world class chess champions, special forces, the military, Blue Angels precision flying team, 17 number ones in the world in sport. It just goes on and on. Surgeons, dentists. And we were always looking for what are the things that can be done to improve their ability to manage stress and to actually execute when it's really important in a mission specific venue.
Yeah.
And I'm a data guy, love big data sets and data trends. And when we looked at the data, I was shocked. It started trending in a particular direction. And what we finally concluded was that what we were doing in all of the training we were doing with all these diverse populations was only one thing. We were getting them healthier. We were getting them healthier physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. And then they would go to the next level automatically if they were capable of doing it. But health is the igniter of performance. And then as we started to prepare for this book, we began to realize that data is directly connected to decision making. So if you are physically tired, beat up, you haven't taken care of yourself, you haven't eaten, you haven't slept right, you go back and you analyze a lot of the decisions that were made, and they were not the good ones. They were often made when you were in a physical deficit. Sometimes you have to make a decision, but it's compromised, and you have to really recognize you're probably stepping into some pretty treacherous territory here if you're making decisions when you're exhausted, when you're completely burned out, when you just physically are unable to bring your best forward. Emotionally, we learned that when you are in a hot positive or hot negative space, you probably need to cool off in either direction before you make your decision. Or, such as road rage, somebody cut you off in traffic, and instantly you are in this mindset, you want to run the guy off the road, you want to kill him or her and you don't even know what's happening, but this emotional circuitry is overtaken everything else. Your logical mind cannot function. And if you make a decision in that moment, you might make a decision to do something that for the rest of your life you will regret and all of your family will regret. And that's because your brain, this massive computer between your ears, has been hijacked by these powerful emotional states, which can undermine completely your decision making. Now, there's great value in emotion, and the emotions are basically connected throughout the body. And this very, highly evolved circuitry, the subcortical circuitry, has been around for a lot longer than this neuroprocessing center that we have, the logical conscious capability of the cortex and the neocortex. But there's still wisdom there. We want to listen to that. But if you're completely off kilter, the body loves homeostasis, it loves balance. And then mentally, if you've been on the same channel for very long, those neurons get fatigued and you can't think as clearly. You don't focus as well. you can't really focus your energy on what's important, what's relevant, what's not. So yeah, we talk about oscillation, getting a little bit of maybe take a brief walk in nature, do something entirely different, call a loved one before you make that decision. Give your neurons a little opportunity to recalibrate, to restore, to renew, so that your conscious mind is very, very keen at the moment of decision. And then the one that was most interesting for us in the data was the single most important dimension of who we are in terms of performance and decision making is something that's not very well articulated by most people. That's the spiritual dimension. And you go, spiritual, what the heck is that? First time it ever appeared in the Harvard Business Review, I wrote an article with Tony Schwartz on the making of a corporate athlete. We talked about the spiritual dimension as the energy of the human spirit, and really the energy associated with your deepest values, your purpose, the beliefs you care most about. And that is what we call intrinsic motivation. That's the fuel that drives brilliance and drives wisdom. And so if you're kind of a little bit unclear as to what is really most important here, take a pause and reflect on project this into the future, 10 years, 5 years, 20 years at your death. If this doesn't play out right, what might be the consequence? And are you completely comfortable if this is the outcome, taking this risk? Or are there other alternatives you need to be considering? Because this one is either all in or all out. And so, you know, we need spiritual health, we need emotional health, we need mental health, and we need physical health. And that's what's going to drive the greatest decisions that may, in fact, change your life in ways that are unimaginable. Maybe you can have the best life possible because you made the right decisions for yourself, for your family, and for your company.
You know, I think of a number of people listening to us pursue certification exams, like a project management certification exam. And so when I think of health, I often think of like chronic sort of health problems. But you give a scenario in the book where it could be someone just, I'm going to stay up and watch an extra episode on Netflix. I'll have an extra glass of wine the night before, and then they maybe don't sleep as well. And then they go in and go, I need some caffeine. They have you talk about stopping by, getting a donut. And then there's health doesn't have to mean a chronic health problem. It could be this
Right.
compounding little decisions that add up that affect the decision that next day, right?
Well, you make a great point. And again, it kind of defies a lot of the way most people think. These little decisions don't seem to be that consequential. But let's say you decide to stay up late and you have a big presentation, and we brought that out an example in the book, and you just decide to stay up late and watch a movie that you have been dying to watch, and you feel like you've earned it, but you don't get to bed late and you don't sleep that well, and your alarm goes off and you push the snooze and you kind of slip through it. And now you wake up and you're considerably behind schedule. Your normal routines are all short-circuited. Now you have to make a decision to have a healthy breakfast. You normally have a healthy, you're going to try to maybe grab some caffeine, maybe stop and get a donut or two. You need some glucose for that presentation. And so you go in and you're not that focused, and you get caught up in the hallway with somebody that, you really weren't clear what you should be doing because your whole routine is out. Normally you go in, you check the room, you make sure everything is right. And this might have been a presentation that could change the trajectory of your life, because they're looking at you in your future for actually taking over this office in another city. And it could be a huge promotion. You walk in, you really haven't checked the projector, it doesn't work. The slides or the PowerPoint is a little bit funky. You don't feel quite yourself. And there's a cascade of events, and they look at you and they go, is this the guy we want to run that operation in Milwaukee? And so you get passed. And you never thought about the fact that it all started with that bloody movie, that simple decision it seems so innocent.
Yeah.
And it actually snowballed into the fact you didn't get the job you wanted. And that's how delicate this process is.
Love it. Yeah. Thanks for walking us through that. There's a clever metaphor used in the book about consulting our YODA, which is the acronym for your own decision advisor. So just to check my understanding, it's not just as simple as a gut feel or instinct. We're not saying check your gut feel, not check your instinct. And it's not simply, although it's related, your inner voice. It's kind of like all of these there. So how do you like to describe what our YODA is and why it's so fundamental to our decision making?
So when we were writing the book, we began to realize with all the research that we were doing in terms of what had been done and on the journals and everything, we realized that there's no question about it. There's a person, a place that you go to make decisions, fast and slow. And the fast ones you just kind of rifle through. But there is kind of a gatekeeper that allows that to happen. And we all have a little decision advisor that's kind of we're tapping into. And that we call it your own decision advisor. And it may be really very, very astute in the advice it gives you, and it may be absolutely the worst.
Yeah.
But it basically reflects your inner voice.
Hmm.
But your own decision advisor spelled out Yoda. And we weren't looking at the Yoda of Star Wars, but the Yoda of Star Wars have some similarities because Yoda was a trained repository of wisdom. Mm-hmm. And it took years to develop it. And it's the same thing with the Yoda in the book. We need to preload Yoda with the right stuff so that it can go somewhere and make a very good choice about what's about to take place before them. And there is, a host of things that need to be uploaded. The most important is kind of what are your values? Where do you want to end up? We do everything from going to the end of your life and figure out what do you want on your tombstone and who are you at your best? What's your best self? We go through a lot of exercises to make sure that Yoda now is equipped with that. And that's a prism through which every decision is made, certainly the ones that can impact, a really important outcome in your life. And even the small ones sometimes have powerful levers in terms of getting you where you want to go. Yeah. So a Yoda is simply a representation of this advisor that we all have. And we learn that fundamentally from those that we've been around. So if we have a very dysfunctional Yoda or inner voice, we often see people making terrible decisions. They've talked to you in ways that you tend to mirror a lot of the same messages that were given to you by authority figures. That becomes, in a sense, the way you talk to yourself. And we learn that inner voice really is the person that directs traffic in your life, decides what energy, and decides whether you're going to do this or that, or let this riffraff through your command center, or are you going to actually only allow good stuff in that is referenced in your decision? So there are some similarities, but this is all about equipping this place. It's called the human insula. There's an area of the brain that seems to have connections to almost every important part of the brain and body, as all the 5 portals, all the sensory portals report in, all of the cognitive, all the logical and analytical data that's being brought to the decision table is connected to this human insula. All the emotional data from your heart, it's called the empathy, heart, or compassion circuitry. And that has connections to this human insula. And even fatigue factors and a lot of the things that we think about in the physical realm also are able to connect to this. It's a powerful exchange in the brain. And so we don't know yet. Neuroscience doesn't know exactly the brain where this is done, where this is all taking place, but it looks like the human insula is playing a critical role. There is a place we go to make decisions.
Mm.
And we need to be more deliberate, not to be so fast. We need to habituate those things that we know are good for us and really make those, like, get up in the morning, go to bed at certain times, eat certain things, and make that a really great habit that paves the way for some fabulous decisions that can be made, because you have a lot of this already taken care of. Now we're pretty healthy. I should make a better decision here based on all these habits, what we call positive habits, that you've acquired, and you stay with them when it's really important.
You know what? It was just fascinated me. Actually, even as you talked about that, but in the book where it talks about how some of this Yoda, some of the development happens before we're even born, right? Like it's some of this starts some of these messages, and there's so much richness in this book for parents, which I never would have expected. But you mentioned one of the greatest gifts we can give to our children is a strong and wise inner voice, so they can develop their Yoda. So, what do you mean by giving them such an inner voice, and how can we do that as parents, and positively or negatively, for that matter?
So it's really an interesting area of research, and the auditory cortex of the unborn, even in utero, is picking up signals, and there are sensors that this unborn child is still picking up, everything from stress levels of the parents in the form of levels of cortisol and so on and so forth. It's also picking up this distress voices, or maybe anger or frustration that's going on around them. And the voice that one develops by the time they're about 5 years of age, that voice has become fairly substantive. It's a reasonably coherent inner narrative. And kids can start talking about how they talk to themselves. They become more aware of it. And that narrative begins to reflect the dominant inputs that have been existing since the child was in utero. And so if you have a very dysfunctional parent who's actually, the messages they're saying, you're never going to amount to anything, you're lazy, you're undisciplined,
You're an inconvenience.
you just don't have what it takes. Even though they're using that to motivate you, those messages get wired in to this inner command center, and Yoda actually starts referencing that in making decisions. So we have a whole section of the book that helps you understand what kind of functionality is that private voice, and do you need to clean that up? And we recommend that most of that's done with your hand in the form of writing, cursive writing, or printing, because we've learned that there's more of an imprint in this executive function from writing and printing than from just self-talk or visualization or through public speaking. So, but there is a way, and I've spent years doing that with athletes. It's actually almost miraculous how you can change the tone and the content of that inner voice, which becomes their Yoda. And that once that Yoda is fully operationalized, it's the greatest gift. And so parents need to know the way children learn how to make decisions is watching you. So if you make decisions very impulsively, if you start deciding what you're going to do, you're going to spank them, or you're very, very, when you're angry, you just start making all kinds of crazy statements and decisions about what the family can and can't do. They watch that, and that becomes part of what they reference when they're making choices in their own lives. So every time you make a decision, you're much better off saying, okay, something just happened here. You really left what we believe is you left the highway here. You're in some really kind of territory we don't like as parents. And we're not sure exactly how we should handle this, but we want to work this through with you so you understand, first of all, how did you make the decision to do that? And how should we make a decision? How do you think you would want to make the decision for someone in your situation? and you begin to work the territory, help them understand the power they have as decision makers. And so every chance you have, just like at the corporate level, every opportunity you have to improve your direct reports' understanding of, being held accountable for, all the factors involved, just de-engineer every decision and then really help everyone be responsible for the choices they make. And don't make them automatically. If you're not ready, hold off. Put a timeline on every decision. When I get up in the morning, I have a things to do list. And then I look at where are the decisions I have to make and how important are they? And then I put a time on them. How much time do I have to make that decision actually occur?
That's interesting.
And so it kind of gives my Yoda a sense of, hey, wait a minute. This is priority number one. It's got to be done by Tuesday. This is priority number two. And so my brain starts working the territory. And then if it's number one, I want to make sure I'm at my best physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, or I'm going to put it off a little bit longer and do something to clear all the channels so I don't make a stupid mistake because I really didn't prepare myself for what I was about to do.
Man, I love that. I love that. A mentor once told me when he tries to make decisions, the lens he used was, what's the story I want to be able to tell my grandchildren someday? Which I thought was kind of a clever one and aligned to what you say, because I've used that to kind of get me thinking further out. And you have different lenses. So tell us about the 7 lenses that you like us, you coach people to think through when they're faced with one of these big decisions.
Well, what you just said there was brilliant, because you really want to think about this decision, how it's going to play out in the future, and how would you explain to people how you made this decision? And you mentioned earlier about this notion of biases. And the human system, there's no question about it. The science is there. We are fiction-making machines. We can sabotage the decision-making process in a myriad of ways. But it always occurs unconsciously. It always occurs when you're in that fast mode. If you slow down and pause and actually try to dig out where you might be duping yourself, where your Yoda is getting bamboozled into getting to the decision you really want. So you walk into a dealership and you fall in love with a car and you go, oh my God, that's the car I've always dreamed of. And you go, and the salesman comes up and starts selling it to you and says, we can make this happen. And you don't even think about anything else. I mean, you are on fire and you make that decision and your brain is trying to exist for a couple of reasons. One, to get you to survive and to get you what you want and need. You want that car, so it's going to figure out how to create a story, a line, convince your Yoda that this is the car you deserve, you can afford it. It's like perfect. And so you're aligned with the salesperson. It aligns with what you really want in life. And you come home having bought that car. Now you have to describe this to your spouse, what the heck you just did. You're so far out of bounds of what you had originally said was something you could do with your financial, responsibilities. And all of a sudden you realize you may have been the worst decision you've ever made. But your brain took you there. The only decision you saw that you could make that was the right one at that dealership was the one you took. And that was, buy that baby. You've earned it. And we're going to make that work. Well, it doesn't work. Now you hate the car and you hate yourself and you created a big problem for your spouse. And now you're looking for a way to unload it and you're going to lose a ton of money. So that is just one example. I can give you hundreds and hundreds of examples of how our brain can actually sabotage us and get us to the decision we want unconsciously. But if you put it out on the table and you check, there are a number of lenses. First of all, what are the facts? Let's get all the facts on the table and don't make up. Let's get, how much money can you spend? What is this going to do to your budget? Obviously what you want, you'd like to have that car, but let's look at your logical mind involved. Let's get, emotionally, are you too hot here to make a good decision? I'm not supposed to make an important decision when I'm really hot, excited, and fired up, or when I'm depressed and sad, angry, or vengeful, like that road rage incident. So I want to calm down. Maybe sleep on it for 24 hours. Have a conversation with your spouse. Oh, if I talk to my spouse, she'll talk me out of it. That's what your brain will say to you. You'll say, don't talk to that person. It'll never happen. And then you go to the physical, and you just tap into all these reservoirs of intelligence, your gut, your heart, but they don't all line up. They just, if you get it on paper. And so when you look at, well, how is this going to play out in 15 years? That lens you suggested with a friend of yours. That is exactly what we try to give you, some examples of lenses. So one of the lenses is really look at this through what you believe your ultimate mission is in life. And it may or may not help you with the decision, but to have a successful life, what's the highest priority that you want to establish for you in your life? Just vet that lens a little bit in the decision you're about to make. And let's just take a look at this decision through what we might call your best self. The self that this is when you are the best version that you could possibly be, and you love this space. You're proud of who you are when you go there. Let's wear that for a moment and look at this decision. Let's look at your best moral self. When you are absolutely your best in terms of how you treat other people and your kindness and your generosity, you look at the amount of money that you're spending here, whatever it is, let's just take a look at that. And there's a whole variety of lenses that we try to outline in the book that you just pass that through, that increases your Yoda's ability to make the right choice. Mm-hmm. And then you do that with your children, and you do it with your direct reports. Yeah. You do it everywhere you can, because this space between the stress and response is the most sacred space we have as human beings. This is what separates us from all other species in the animal kingdom. No one can pause and change direction intentionally. We have the ability to be deliberate and intentional. And then you say, I would like to habituate, make it automatic that I get up and go to bed at a certain time. And I'm staying with it unless it's on the weekend and it's not that critical. So you habituate that, called myelinate that, repeatedly, and all of a sudden you don't have to put any energy into that at all. So now you have energy left over, the conservation of energy principle. Now you can use that energy for more deliberation, more intense thought on how you want to respond. And then you kind of work it out in advance. Let's say you get so irritated when people cut you off in traffic or do something, and then you work it out and you decide in advance how you're going to deal with that. And you look at, if I do go a little bit nuts here, what might that mean? I could get into a fight, I could end up hurting someone, or I could get shot. Is that worth the whole thing about going into a rage at that moment and just being who I want to be at that moment? Because they deserve to be hurt. Right. And so the more we can prepare to use this brilliant neural processor that we have between our ears and fuel this intentional, deliberate way of processing, it changes how we operate in life. We'll still make bad choices, but we'll make them with the confidence it was the best I could do at that moment, and you'll have few regrets.
I like it. I'm thinking of some recent examples in sports where someone punches someone else, or when you and I are recording this, there was a time where a professional basketball player punches a wall, breaks his hand, and now he'll be out of the championship games. And now he would never say, I think I'm going to punch that wall. And the force, I mean, he would never think that, right? But these emotions and feelings, in fact, honestly, Jim, I think your treatment of emotions and feelings in the book was worth the price of the book on its own. I mean, all this other stuff is really good, but even a better understanding of emotions and feelings, I'd be interested. Any of the most valuable lessons come to mind that you've learned about this relationship between emotions, feelings, and decisions?
So we are really interesting. This is the most primitive part, the subcortical region, this region of the brain that's, really responsible for, really understanding an emotional response. Every single thought we have is almost instantly paired with some kind of emotion or feeling.
Hmm.
In fact, you can't really think emotional. It's almost impossible for us to think without having some emotion really connected to those thoughts. And all the science around this shows that there is a very interesting chemistry that's bubbling up when we have in the emotional part of our architecture. And it actually comes up and is made conscious through feelings. And the more we can understand what the physiology is or what's going on beneath the surface, I have these feelings and it's linked to something.
Mhm.
And so the more you can kind of become a little bit of a detective, Mark Brackett, who was the founder of the Emotional Intelligence Lab at Yale, developed this program called Ruler.
It's brilliant.
And it's in over 4,000 schools across the country. And he demonstrated conclusively that if you help kids label emotions, to regulate, to recognize, to actually become more comfortable understanding the language of emotion, the better these kids will handle these fits that come up, the disappointments, the anger, the frustration, when they get on social media and they get their feelings hurt and they want to strike out. Are you angry? Are you anxious? Can you put a label on that? What is the most intelligent way of dealing with that? And you start that when they're very young, and it translates into a Yoda that's much more measured, much more likely to give good advice when the situation calls for it. So emotions represent a language of the body that has been evolving for thousands and thousands of years. The new kid on the block is our capacity for logic, rational thought. But when you put the two together and you use this rational processing system to understand what is being sent via these emotions that bubble up in the form of feelings, the system is fully integrated. It's a marvel. And the more we can deconstruct how it's engineered, the better off we're going to be.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I would have kind of conflated emotions and feelings and not really put a distinction between them. But I love how you in the book that it's the emotions are the almost like the chemical reaction internally. The feelings are a result of that. And then if we can learn to
Exactly.
label that and recognize that, like your former co-author, Tony Schwartz, told us years ago in a podcast that his rule of triggers was whenever you feel like you must, don't. And if we can learn to recognize that feeling of like, oh, I just gotta. Oh, I learned to recognize that because whatever I'm going to say is going to fly off my lips like a flock of doves here, and they're not coming back. So, yeah, yeah, that's good. Let me just wrap it up with one question, a scenario question here, Jim. Let's
Okay.
say someone listening to us, let's say they work for a company that's going through some tough times, and a decision's being made higher up in the organization, and our listener doesn't really agree with that decision, but they also feel like, man, if I speak up or push back, it might hurt me, like might even threaten my job. And, they hear what the company's saying, but they think maybe there's more to it, some other agendas, and they're trying to decide whether they should just keep their head low and their mouth shut or if they should speak up. So, just take some of the ideas from your book to kind of help us think through that scenario.
So that's a real life situation that is probably fairly common.
Mhm.
And that is why you're in training every single day for those situations. Because the decision you make, it came up recently with a client that I had who was very disenchanted with the company that they were working for,
Hmm.
and a very high level executive. And so we started working through. He was a very educated Yoda, but he was so angry with what was happening in the company and the fact that they weren't really listening to anyone except those in that inner circle. And he thought it was really not in the best interest of the company or any of the employees.
Mm.
And he said, so I'm pretty serious. I'm going to make the decision to bail. And I said, okay. And so I said, before we make that decision, what do we have to do? And he says, well, we need to go and get deep into all the aspects of this and realize the consequences, long-term, short-term, the prism, everything else. And I said, what's the most important value to you in your life?
Hmm.
He says, the well-being of my family. And I said, okay. And I said, if you lose your job, if you walk out, you just quit, what's going to happen to the well-being financially of your family, and how you have 3 sons that are now going to be in college, and how hard will it be for you to find a job? He said, it's going to be very difficult. So we began to look at this through the lens of the consequences in 5 years, 10 years, and how he might not be able to reach out and help his children. And then we looked at how might there be ways for you to register your concerns in a way that might be viewed as someone with wisdom and perspective that could, in fact, maybe it won't change anything, but it will help you at least feel like you are heard. And we talked about how are some of those ways you can do that and not get on a blacklist and not be seen as a threat to the company or as just a troublemaker. And so we worked through that, and he's now still working. He feels it was probably the best decision that he could have possibly made under those circumstances.
That's great.
And if he'd have gone off and done what he wanted in that moment, he would have quit.
Yeah.
And he's quite happy, and he's able to help his kids through school.
Mm-hmm.
And he was able to pay for a lot of the tuition and everything in college. And so that's the idea, is to just don't fly off the handle because you're feeling like you want to get out of this mess. Let's just look at it much bigger. Let's go through all the lenses. Let's take some time and let's extrapolate well into the future. What are the consequences that might be to the people that mean most to you if you make this decision? And so I'm pretty sure he made the right decision.
And it's interesting in that situation, if it would have been some sort of ethical sort of concern, it could be that despite losing the income, it still might have.
It's a great point. This was not ethical. This was not an ethical issue. This was, he didn't agree with some of the directions. If it had been ethical, we'd have ended up in a different place altogether.
Yeah. I love it. Well, for those listening, whether at home or work, I mean, our life is filled with making decisions. And I recommend you get a copy of Jim's new book, Wise Decisions, a science-based approach to making better choices. I put links to the book and the book's website in the show notes for this cast. So, Jim, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Oh, I really appreciate the time we spent. I really love your questions and your ability to get to the nitty-gritty. I love this kind of an interview. You've really done your homework and gotten into the nuances of decision making, and that's what really excites me. So I hope our listeners found value in the way I did in our interaction.
Thank you so much, Jim. Thank you.